Hello, and welcome to another session on methodology of literature. With this video, we complete our module 2 and we shall resume or start our module 1 again. So, the last topic or the last psychoanalyst discussed in your text is Slavoj Zizek. Slavoj Zizek, according to Terry Eagleton, is the most brilliant exponent of psychoanalysis and also cultural theory in general. Zizek is influenced chiefly by the philosophy of Hegel, the politics of Marx, and psychoanalysis of Lacan. His key contribution to psychoanalysis is the exploration of Lacanian notion of fantasy. Fantasy, Zizek argues, plays an organizing role in the formation of selfhood. It is different from illusion. It is something that organizes how one perceives and understands reality. It works as a frame through which one develops one's sense of the world, that is, one's perspective of the world. The uniqueness of an individual is a result of his idea of fantasy. According to Freud, fantasy is opposed to reality. It is purely an illusory product of imagination, which in fact stands in the way of correct perception of reality. Whereas to Lacan, fantasy works as a mode of defense. The concept of fantasy is central to Freud's work. Indeed, the origin of psychoanalysis is bound up with Freud's recognition in 1897 that memories of seduction are sometimes the product of fantasy rather than traces of real sexual abuse. This is according to, or this implies that, as I stated earlier, to Freud, fantasy is opposed to reality. It is merely an illusory product of the imagination, and it does not give the correct perception of reality. So Freud uses the term fantasy to denote a scene which is presented to the imagination and which stages an unconscious desire. The fantasized scene may be conscious or unconscious, and it is not immediately apparent. But to Lacan, fantasy is different. Lacan compares fantasy or the fantasy scene to a frozen image on a cinema screen. Just as the film may be stopped at a certain point in order to avoid showing a traumatic scene which follows, so also the fantasy scene is a defense which veils castration. Thus, fantasy is thus characterized by a fixed and immobile quality. Now, what is this castration? Now, castration, according to Freud, refers to a movement of separation by the Oedipal law between mother and infant, and is therefore a requirement of culture. It is the positive side of the prohibition of incest. Freud emphasizes that instinctual renunciation is necessary for all cultural achievement, associating it with the Oedipus complex and its resolution. Freud used this term castration complex to refer to an infantile theory of sexuality adopted by children to explain the difference between the sexes. Freud emphasizes the phallocentrism of children who, assuming the possession of a penis is in all living creatures, attribute the lack of it to a castration. The very attribution of a lack is the result of a fantasy of castration, in relation to which the boy will experience castration anxiety and which will contribute to an experience of disillusionment in the girl. Freud's argument in the case of the boy is that his wish to take his mother as his sexual partner is given up due to the threat from the father that he will lose his penis, that instrument of erotic sensation, if he carries out his wishes. So therefore, in this, it leads the boy to renunciation of the mother as his sexual partner and to wait for a time when he can take another woman as his partner. So this is what castration refers to according to Freud. And Lacan compares this fantasy or this fantasy scene as a defense which veils, which masks castration. But to Cizek argues in The Plague of Fantasies that fantasy is the primordial form of narrative and that it serves to hide an original and inseparable deadlock, such as the impossibility of the fulfillment of desire because its actual object cannot match the one it imagines. Such contradictions indicate the real beyond language. Now, the real here is a reference to the real stage of Lacan's real stage. Now, the real stage is not an age here, but rather the fulfillment or the perfection which we studied in the last video. Now, though it is the baby or the infant stage, it is a stage where the child considers or is in the perfect order, and therefore this order can never be, or we can never come back to this order, or we can never return to this phase once we enter the mirror stage. That means this stage is a stage of perfection. For Cizek, fantasy, even when rebellious, supports ideology by serving as its inherent transgression a level of imaginary misbehavior that allows us to accept the limits of reality. The formation of fantasy constitutes a situation in which satisfaction lies at a further level in the hands of an unreachable other. It is this ideal figure who is imagined to complete fulfillment, not oneself. Like many of Cizek's foundational theory, fantasy derives from the psychoanalytical work of both Freud and Lacan. For Cizek, fantasy is not an exercise in fulfillment, contentment, or satisfaction. Instead, it provides a scene for a privileged yet arbitrary object that embodies the force of desire. In his book, The Sublime Object of Ideology, Cizek argues that reality is a fantasy construction which enables people to mask the real of their desire. Freud gives an account of a man who dreams that his dead son came to him to complain, "Can't you see that I am burning?" Now, it's a very interesting story. This is one case that had been Freud reports in one of his work in his books. The story or the case is like this. A father had been watching beside his child's sick bed for days and nights on end. After the child had died, he went into the next room to lie down, but left the door open so that he could see from his bedroom into the room in which his child's body was laid out, with tall candles standing around it. An old man had been engaged to keep watch over it and sat beside the body, murmuring prayers. After a few hours' sleep, the father had a dream that his child was standing beside his bed, caught him by the arm, and whispered to him reproachfully, "Father, don't you see I am burning?" He woke up, noticed a bright glare of light from the next room. He hurried into the room and found that the old man had dropped off to sleep, and that the wrappings and one of the arms of his beloved child's dead body had been burned by a lighted candle that had fallen on them. Freud argues that, in line with his theory that dreams are wish fulfillments, the purpose of the dream was to prolong the sleep of the father for few moments more, because in it his dead child was still alive. The dead child behaved in the dream like a living one. He himself warned his father, came to his bed and caught him by the arm, just as he had probably done on the occasion from the memory of which the first part of the child's words in the dream were derived. For the sake of fulfillment of this wish, the father prolonged his sleep for one moment. The dream was preferred to a waking reflection because it was able to show the child as once more alive. If the father had woken up first and then made the inference that led him to go into the next room, he would, as it were, have shortened his child's life by that moment of time. Lacan, however, notes that the dream itself contains another, more terrifying real, which is what wakes the father. And this is not simply that the dream is telling the father to wake up because of the events in the adjoining room. Rather, it's the reproach of the son to his father. Is there not more reality in this message than in the noise by which the father also identifies the strange reality of what is happening in the room next door? Is it not the missed reality that caused the death of the child expressed in these words? Freud himself does not tell us that we must recognize in this sentence what perpetuates for the father those words forever separated from the dead child that were said to him. Perhaps Freud supposes because of the fever, but who knows? Perhaps these words perpetuate the remorse felt by the father that the man he has put at his son's bedside to watch over him may not have been up to the task. He may not have been up to his job. In fact, he has gone to sleep. In Freud's account of the dream, there is an implication that the child had died of fever, which is what Lacan is hinting at this quote. So perhaps the child is reproaching his father for not having done something sooner to prevent his death. And there is also the possible reproach that the father had entrusted the task of looking over his son's body to someone who was not up to the job. Cisak points out that the subject does not wake himself when the external irritation becomes too strong. The logic of his awakening is quite different. First, he constructs a dream, a story which enables him to prolong his sleep to avoid awakening into reality, the child's death. But the thing he encounters in his dream, the reality of his desire, the Lacanian real, in our case, the reality of the child's reproach to his father, "Can't you see that I am burning?" implying the father's fundamental guilt, which is more terrifying than the so-called external reality itself. And that is why he awakes to escape the real of his desire, which announces itself in the terrifying dream. As Sisak goes on to argue that the father awakens so he can carry on dreaming, in the sense that by returning to external reality, he can escape from something even more horrifying. Of course, this is not how we normally think about dreams, and especially about Freud's idea, which sees dreams as wish fulfillments. Freud spends a lot of time and effort in justifying this theory, particularly when it comes to dreams which appear to suggest the opposite. Of course, neither Lacan or Zizek are suggesting that the father's desire was to recognize his own guilt with regards to his son's death. What's at stake here is the real of such a desire, the reality, which is something quite different. Let's suppose for a moment that Freud is correct in assuming that the father constructed the dream in order to prolong the life of his son. In other words, in the dream, his son appears by his father's bedside very much alive. But then his whispers in his father's ear, "Can't you see that I am burning?" This is the real of the father's desire. That is what lies behind his desperate wish that his son be alive, if only for a few moments longer. Interestingly, it's the words that betray the real of the dream rather than the image of the dream. In other words, what we do not have here is a ghostly visitation. It's not a ghost, or it's not a spectral appearance of the son. Rather, it's those words, those fatal words that reveal the awful truth to the father and triggers his awakening. And perhaps this just reinforces the fact that the real is in effect the function of language, rather than some imaginary outside of the language. It's not the image, but rather it is those words produced by the son that leads to his awakening. And what is this truth? Not as far as we can tell that the boy is actually conveying to his father that next door his dead body is being consumed by the flames. If this were the case, then it would be more likely that an image of a burning child would have constituted the dream. It would also suggest some very strange and supernatural process was in play, in the sense that the dead child was actually able to communicate through the dream with his father. Leaving aside this possibility, it's not the right one. Fascinating as it is, the real truth, the real trauma contained in those words is that his son is already dead from the burning fever, which perhaps the father could have done something to prevent. And is there also something of burning resentment in those whispered words? We do not know. Okay, this is a very terrifying thing too, and therefore language is what is at play here. Language is rather more terrifying than the image of the child coming to his father and reproaching his father. It could be because, if Freud was right, it could be if he was right, then it could be that the child had fever and he died of fever. That Freud kept on saying that the child died of fever, and therefore it is the father's guilt that he could have done something about it. But to Lacan, the language, he says it's all about the father prolonging the dream because he doesn't want to come back to reality. He doesn't want to awaken to reality. He wants his son to live at least in that dream for a moment more. He doesn't want to accept his inability to accept the reality. Okay. So in other words, the reality to which he awakens is less real than that which he encountered in his dream. Zizek explains the fantasy construction of reality with examples from popular culture. From reality to real, he argues that fantasy is staging of desire. Now, he uses another short story by Patricia Highsmith, Black House. Through this, Zizek shows that fantasy space functions as an empty surface, a kind of screen for the projection of desires. Okay, and then the story goes like this: there's a small town in America. All men gather in a bar that evening, and they talk about their past. They talk about the old black house on the hill just outside the town. It is here that they had always come, or they recall their certain adventures, especially sexual adventures taking place there. However, the general, amongst these men at present, these people cannot go back to that old house now. It is almost in ruins, and that going back to that house would be dangerous because they are not young anymore, they are old, and going back back to that house would be really dangerous. So a young newcomer in the town informs that he is not afraid to visit the old house. He goes to the house. He finds the house in ruin and decay, and on coming back to the bar, he informs the men that the old black house, that is the focal point of their memories, is no different from their old decaying property. The men are annoyed and irritated and shocked by this news, and the young man is killed while he attempts to leave the bar by one of the old men. Now, the reason for murder of the newcomer, Zizek says that the black house was eschewed by old men because it was an empty space where they could project their nostalgic desires, their distorted memories. When the reality of the titular black house is designated as nothing but an old ruin by a young intruder, the fantasy space becomes an everyday, ordinary reality to these old men. The annulment of the difference between reality and fantasy space in the young man's adventure forces the old men to kill him. So Zizek explores the relationship between desire and fantasy. In his analysis, the former desire is endlessly reproduced in our fantasies, and it is never fulfilled or fully satisfied. From reality to the real, he argues that the disappearance of desire would bring in anxiety. To him, anxiety threatens to eliminate lack itself and end desire of the symbolic order. This is so, as Lacan argues, without lack there is no desire. In Zizek, desire is a retroactive process. What I desire is organized by processes of fantasy which fix on an object and generate a desire which appears to have drawn me to the object, but which in fact did not exist until I first fixed upon the object. Zizek concludes the paradox of desire is that it poise retroactively in its own course. That is, the object, a small object, is an object that can be perceived only by a gaze distorted by desire, an object that does not exist for an objective gaze. So with this we come to the end of the module 2, and of this theories, psychoanalytical theory, Freud and Lacan are really important, and especially the difference between Freudian and Lacanian approach, okay, and also how fantasy is different to all the three of them, Freud, Lacan and Zizek. Okay, so you'll have to do a little bit of research, because Zizek's, the whole thing is taken, I took it from the text and have given it to you. You will have to do a little bit of research on Zizek yourself. All right, so thank you and keep safe.